Okay, in this part of the series, we're going to start covering helicopters. And helicopters are a modern only thing. You're only going to find these in any of the modern scenario and modules. Helicopters themselves are very similar to ground vehicles in the fact that they have two modes that they can be in. Just like armored vehicles can be opened or buttoned, helicopters are either going to be in hovering or flying modes. They can change this once per impulse, and also keep in mind that there is a stacking restriction when it comes to helicopters, and you can only have one helicopter per hex. When it comes to flying mode, that's their default mode. So this counter that I have laid out here is in flying mode. If they don't have the hover marker or flipped over to their hover side, then they're going to be considered to be in flying mode. Flying mode is considered one level above the terrain in the hex of whatever hex they're in. So if they're in a level 0 hex like this one is in the road hex, the helicopter is considered to be at level 1. But if they were in a hex with a hill that was at level 3, 4, 5, whatever, they would be considered to be one level higher than that. Helicopters also have unlimited movement factor when they're in flying mode, so they can take and move from one end to the board or back. It does not matter. Just like with fixed wing aircraft though, it's going to be considered one movement point per hex that they go into, and switching from hover mode to fly mode is going to constitute one movement point as well. You need to keep that in mind for op fire purposes. Helicopters are a little different than other units in the fact that they can enter a enemy held hex. So if these NVA troops here were in this hex, this helicopter could actually fly into it, but you can't conduct melee or close assaults or anything like that. But they are considered adjacent. No matter which mode a helicopter is in, it's considered adjacent to the hex that it's in and all 6 surrounding hexes. Now, a helicopter can't hover in a hex that contains enemy units. So if this NVA troop was here and the helicopter was flying through, it could not then try to switch into its hover mode and stay in that hex. Now, when the helicopter itself is in flying mode, there is no auto spot for adjacent enemies. So while it's flying through here, it's not considering to see these adjacent enemy forces, but they can see him because a helicopter is always going to be considered spotted. A helicopter can fire its weapons while it's flying, but it's going to incur a pretty severe penalty at -2 firepower for its gun weapons and a +2 on its ordnance to hit table. It can, though, fire its weapons at different hexes. So in flying mode, it could fire its guns at this set or this squad, and it could fire its ordnance at this squad. When it's in hover mode, however, it can fire its weapons without penalty, but it can only fire them at enemies in a single hex. While flying, a helicopter also can't be targeted by unguided ordnance fire table weapons. While hovering, a helicopter, you can think of it as pretty much the reverse of the rules when it comes to flying, with a few minor exceptions. Hovering, it's still going to be considered one level above whatever terrain is in the hex, but it can't leave the terrain, the hex that it's in. So this helicopter here, if it switched into hover mode, you would mark it as hover, but you can't take and say, oh, it drifted or something like that. When it's hovering, it stays in the hex it's in unless it switches back into flying mode and then proceeds on. While it is in hover mode though, it does auto spot adjacent enemy units, so these guys in the building would be considered spotted if the helicopter was adjacent to them and hovering. And like I said previously, it can fire without penalties, but it must fire at targets in the same hex. But it can be fired at by unguided ordnance fire table weapons. Things like RPGs and the like can fire at a hovering helicopter, while they can't fire at a flying helicopter.